We're going to be talking about Flowers of Fire, the inside story of South Korea's feminist movement and what it means for women's rights worldwide by Hawon Jung. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Today, we are going to be led by our featured authors, Leah Libresco Sargeant, who is a writer who advocates for a culture that sees the dignity in mutual dependence instead of aspiring to an impossible autonomy. She runs the Other Feminism Substack, which focuses on the way the world treats women as defective men. Her most recent book, Building the Benedict Option, was published in 2018. And her next book, The Dignity of Dependence, will be published in fall 2025 by Notre Dame University Press. Patrick T. Brown is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where his work with the Life and Family Initiative focuses on developing a robust pro-family economic agenda and supporting families as the cornerstone of a healthy and flourishing society. And you all on this call are hearing this first, but Patrick is going to be our newest featured author. We'll be announcing that this Friday. So congratulations to Patrick for joining the team. We are also joined by Spencer Klavan, who is Associate Editor of the Claremont Review of Books, host of the Young Heretics podcast, and author most recently of Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science Through Faith. He can be found on Substack at Rejoice Evermore and on X under Spencer Klavan. Eliza Mondegreen is a writer and researcher studying gender identity with a focus on exploring online trans communities and understanding the beliefs underlying the gender affirmative model of medical practice. She writes at the Substack Gender Hacked. And I'm Serena Sigillito. I'm the editor of Fair Disputations. We have a relatively small group here today, but we may be joined a little bit later by two additional featured authors, Rachel Liu and Nadya Williams. So they may be joining in the conversation as well. We'll also be sharing this recording afterwards. So if you enjoy it, please share it with your friends. Now I'm going to hand things over to Leah, who will get our discussion kicked off. Take it away, Leah.
Thank you so much, Serena. I was interested in reading this book, and I've got the Kindle version right here, Flowers of Fire, because I feel like South Korea has replaced the novel Children of Men as the sort of reductio ad, if not absurdum, then catastrophum, sorry for the mangled Latin, Spencer, of what America's gender and child future could look like. So South Korea is a country that in some ways seems to be a portrait of all the difficult trends we're facing here, run in hyperdrive. So in South Korea, they're not just below the rate of fertility you need for basic replacement. That's 2.1. They're at a rate so low, less than one child per woman, that even if you doubled their fertility rate, they still wouldn't quite be in shouting distance of the replacement rate. You're not just seeing men and women coming apart as you are in America, where you're seeing greater and greater political divergence and less cross-socialization. You're seeing what I would describe both before and after reading this book as a gender war, where there's not just some light dog whistling or heated rhetoric from politicians, where you can actually elect an anti-feminist politician who is running on the platform of abolishing the Ministry of Gender Affairs. We've seen that a little bit in the most recent election, but not to the same degree. So my big question reading this book was, what is going on in South Korea? And to what extent does this represent a possible or plausible future from America? And if it is a glimpse of a possible future, what can we do to stop it? And what surprised me most, and I'll turn over to Patrick in a minute for his thoughts too, in discussing with Patrick, was genuinely how much worse the situation was for women and for men in South Korea than I anticipated. It wasn't America, but 10% more difficult or 20% more aggrieved. This was kind of an order of magnitude difference in tension between the sexes. This is a culture that had an epidemic of spy cams, where it was common, not just a notable news story, but common for you, for your friends, for your teachers to all be caught by spy cams in bathrooms and upskirting videos, and that men traded these videos like currency. This is a culture where there wasn't a matter of a particular school where there was common sex abuse by teachers or one particular problem teacher protected by the administration, but teachers working together to prey on young girls. And what you see there really is a different level of kind of understandable antipathy between the sexes, a broken trust, and a real degradation of men who more and more weren't interacting with women, but were interacting with stolen images of women, fantasies of women, and have less and less encounter with women or families at all. So in some ways, I know I'm rattling off all the most depressing parts of the book, and I've left out some of the more violent parts, but this book left me hopeful because it doesn't feel like this is just one step into the future for America. It feels like there is a genuine, deep, unusual wound in South Korea that I'm not entirely sure what it would take to heal, but that America isn't currently on track for that degree of coming apart. And with that, I turn it over to my slightly more pessimistic in many cases, but perhaps not here, colleague Patrick Brown.
Oh, thanks, Leah, and thanks to everybody for being here and joining in. I am especially grateful. The recording will be out there. We can have an interactive conversation, but more than anything, I'm just happy to be excused to talk about it with some writers who I've known of and are interested to hear their thoughts about it. So I'm going to keep my remarks short so we can get right into the meat of the discussion. I want to hear what other people think. But I agree with Leah in the sense that South Korea, similarly, when we picked up the book, I kind of thought, okay, well, this is going to be a glimpse into a potential future that, like Scrooge and A Christmas Carol, we can choose to avoid. And I think genuinely agree that with Leah that I don't think that this is the most likely future for the US or even a very plausible one. South Korea went through a sort of a hyperspeed modernization and development in a way that the US didn't. We were on the technological frontier for most of the 20th century. South Korea compressed all of that into a very short amount of time, which means it's the sense that I got from the book, and having never been to South Korea, that's as best as I can do, is that they are still struggling with what it means to be the most internet connected society in the world, and to have all these modern pressures on women about what they need to look like and how they need to both fill the archetype of deferential woman and sort of the almost the servant of the household, but also recognizing that they're educated more than ever and trying to participate in the workforce. There's a similar tensions in the US, but nowhere near the incommensurability of these responsibilities and roles they're trying to face. So it's no wonder that South Korean women feel like there's no other way than to opt out and to try to carve out these niche communities and these sort of communes almost that we read about in the book, or some of these more diverse gender expressions and that sort of thing. I don't think that the in a sense, I guess I could say that the fear that I had in 2024 coming into the election and immediately out of it when American women were aping the 4B movement and posting about it on TikTok, my reaction now is very different then. I almost think it's almost an insult to the South Korean woman to compare their plight to the one that we're facing here. And I think it would be interesting to talk about why the US has avoided the kind of omnipresent spy cam debacle that it seems to be ever present in South Korean society. I mean, that it would be nice to know what we're doing right. And again, I think the fact that we had more time to work through some of these tensions is also part of it too. But with that, that's a very short speed run because Lee and I had our chance to kind of share our thoughts as we were reading through. So I guess am I leading? Am I turning it over or Leah? Maybe you can go through our order. Okay, who's first? Why don't we go to Eliza for her initial salvo on what she got from this book?
Sure. Well, I was also really struck by the extremity of the situation facing Korean girls and women and the kind of what feels like an unnecessary extremity of response and just how hopeless that situation seemed to be in terms of like, how could that divide between the sexes ever be bridged? And it was really just this this fascinating portrait of the movement and the kind of the counter movement among some men rejecting feminism and in some cases rejecting online caricatures of feminism. There was, let's see, I would really have loved to see just a little bit more space in the book dedicated to kind of setting the scene more broadly, like how exceptional we know that the spy cam porn problem, it seems to be absolutely pervasive, that women are having to take precautions all the time and that it's not sufficient to actually protect them from, the ubiquity of this problem. But there were some of the other problems and some of the other, it would have been really nice to get a more contextualized picture of like how widespread is this in Korean society. We have the birth rate collapsing. That's a pretty strong indicator that there are problems, but you know, it would be good to know like, okay, are there like normal men and women who are still able to connect, and what does that look like? What share of the female population is involved in these kind of opt-out movements? I think there were like 2 pages in the conclusion about some male feminist activists, but just not a real picture on like how much is this a part of like a normal young person's life. And let's see, I was also really struck by the rigidity of the roles, the problem of a hyper online society where everybody is interacting either with these, you know, the young men interacting with the unwillingly filmed women instead of real women, and both sides interacting with kind of the worst extremes of fractious online conflict, like in terms of like, okay, the feminists who are understandably extremely fed up, they're using this extreme language that's alienating men. The men are also being, you know, being very nasty online. I'm not going to imply that there's quite an equivalence there, I think, but it's definitely, it's not encouraging for how to come back from that kind of divide. And the other thing that I thought was interesting was the discussion of just the trans issues right near the end of the book. And on the one hand, how much kind of the inclusion, the attempt to include men who identify as women within the women's movement in Korea in the setting of extreme sexual inequality in Korea, it was frustrating to see that issue was so divisive there, that women who were insistent that like sex was the basis of their oppression were being ousted from the feminist movement, that men who identify as women were like, they were really counteracting many of the women's initiatives to like free women from the corset, that movement, saying that they needed to like lean on those stereotypes in order to pass. And I also wondered, we have these incredibly rigid roles, we have this incredibly online society, we have these accounts of males who are identifying as women, but it was like, we don't know what are women transitioning to. Like, is that a response that women are having to those rigid roles and to that hyper online world? And just the kind of nature of the book taking, in the end, self-identity over sex as the definition of a woman, those women got lost from the account. And I'm really curious if they're out there.
Thank you, Eliza. And I'll add a little context for anyone who didn't get quite to the end of the book before the book club. The corset comment she was making, the reference is to a movement against narrow standards for women's beauty. And there the tension is South Korean women who are trying to push back against a culture that is such a homogenized view of women, that plastic surgery is common, dieting is common, not wearing glasses to the point where wearing glasses could get you fired, not from a job where you're on TV, just from any job. You were expected to do it with contacts or nearsighted. And then on the other hand, you have people who are trying to transition who then need to fit into that view of women to be read as a woman. And then you have this tension of what is the view of South Korean women that the women are trying to cleave to. They know what they don't want to be part of anymore. What is the positive view of what a woman is? Spencer, I'll kick it over to you next.
Sure. Thank you. Well, like Patrick, I've been chomping at the bit to have a conversation about this book with some other smart people who have read it, because I am so confused and I have so many thoughts and questions. I agree with many of the observations that have been made up to this point. The one thing I'll add is that as I began to read, my first thought was, is this going to be the book that finally radicalizes me about American imperialism? Because like a lot of you, I don't know anything about South Korea, or didn't know anything about South Korea going into this book. And this book is still really my only serious route into knowing about South Korea. But it seems to me that the condition there is similar to one in a country that I do know slightly more about, and that's Japan. And in Japan, what you have is this similar kind of sudden slingshot into modernity as a result of very severe pressures from the West, economic, military, and so forth, which creates a kind of overlay or palimpsest of a very traditionalist, kind of rigid is a word that's been used, society with hyper defined, and we would think perhaps old fashioned roles for men and women, as well as for all sorts of other people, uh, or rather along all sorts of other lines, on top of which there is overlaid like late stage modernity without much else in between. And I think this can help us account for the really just radically disorienting breakneck shifts between pro child and anti child policy and rhetoric that we encounter throughout the book. We also, I think it accounts for a lot of the um, severe dysfunction that emerges between, for instance, with women being trapped both under uh, the kind of insane Instagramized beauty standards of the modern West and the restricted sphere of a pre-industrial, essentially, society. Um, Whereupon this very tense situation is then hit with yet another Western cultural export, namely Me Too, which seems equally ill suited to the contours of the specific Korean situation. And so, Leah, in some ways, it seemed like actually the salient feature here is how unlike Korea is to America, and then how um, distortionary and deforming it is to be constantly um, subjected to all sorts of paradigms that are already kind of dysfunctional here in the States, but are dysfunctional in other ways and at yet a second level in South Korea, and especially the weird tension of thinking that many of the overheated and extreme claims of Me Too in America are actually closer to the truth about women's situation in South Korea. And yet the reaction to them is coded almost entirely to an American context. And this, I think, also produces the subsequent kind of battle of the sexes or what have you. I'll stop there, but this is just very interesting to me.
I want to sneak in one follow-up question before we go on, because I'm curious. I agree with you that I feel like the biggest worries of Me Too are kind of lived out in South Korea, but you're not saying that then the response feels proportional or well suited. So I'm curious. The question for me most of the time reading the book is, okay, when you're not dealing with there are a few bad apples or there are an appreciable number of bad apples, but there's just a culture that says women in the office are totally licit as sexual prey at after work drinking events. It's not clear that there's any kind of easy response that won't spark a huge backlash because you are uprooting office culture. You can't just fire your way out of the problem. So I was curious, what did you feel was aligned or wasn't aligned here?
Right. It's a great question, and it speaks to the other issue you raised, which is what is the archetype or ideal of South Korean womanhood that these ladies are supposed to aim for? Because as you say, if rape culture, so called, exists anywhere in the world, it surely exists here, as described in the book. And um, and so there is as like a wholesale revision of the assumptions that needs to happen, especially online, where anonymity creates this hyper pornified um, set of expectations and these really grotesque abuses. But also, yeah, in person. Um, and so some of the government initiatives that were undertaken to kind of redress this seemed like maybe down the right track, a kind of re-education in the most benign sense of that term. Um, but also, in America, we have problems about how to retain kind of continuity with our pre-industrial past or recover a continuity with our pre-industrial past, even as we adjust to the new realities of the digital world. Um, and one thing that I wished about the book, and I want to say this delicately. The book is written not just in a pro Me Too mode, but in a sort of triumphalist mode, that made it very, very hard for me to. I felt that I was discerning some of the same pathologies under the surface of the book's text that Me Too has produced here. For instance, questions of evidentiary basis for accusations, right? And these were always portrayed as backlash or as, but they seemed to me that they were actual issues. And I didn't know how to untangle those, not having any other source of information than the book. But I guess, yeah, it's really, Leah, it comes back to what you asked, which is what's the condition that we're aiming for here? Hard enough to ask in America, but seems devilishly hard in South Korea.
Emma, with us kind of on some of the hardest parts of the book, I want to kick it over to you for your thoughts.
Sorry, who are you kicking it over to, Leah?
I'm kicking it to Emma.
Oh, she's here helping us.
My mistake. I got all right. Then
I'll jump in on that though,
Yeah.
because I also
yeah.
kind of had the same sense that Spencer had, which was reading this book in February 2025 felt like a lot more of an artifact than it may have felt 2 years ago, right? And so this sort of, I think it's fair to say, more or less, that the Me Too era in the U.S. has ended, at least in the current time, and who knows what will happen down the road. But it definitely felt like we in the U.S. have the luxury of moving past these concerns, or at least to the same degree that they were being surfaced in 2017, 2018. I'm sure that's not the case in South Korea, despite some of the recent electoral backlash that they've been facing. So obviously, I'm now curious for a follow-up from either this author or somebody with a more jaundiced eye towards some of these claims. Looking for a South Korean skeptic of some of this to adjudicate some of the other sort of point that I was struck by and I think I mentioned this in one of my comments in our conversation in the third part, Leah, was, could all of this, or at least a lot of it, maybe be ameliorated, if not solved, by South Korea just logging off? Obviously the drinking culture and the work culture is a problem, and it needs to be addressed. But so much of the tendency to see the worst in the opposite sex, obviously the pornography and the spy cams and all this sort of stuff, seems like it's just fueled by a culture that's even more online than we are. It's sort of like if you took the gender relations that you see on Twitter and had that be, normative across American society, which is not. But in South Korea, maybe it's closer to reality. And to Spencer's point, maybe that anonymity, that the sense that, or the reality that shrinking fertility means fewer siblings, which means fewer opportunities to interact with other members of the opposite sex in a non-confrontational culture. All of these things sort of feed on each other. So I was kind of curious, to imagine what if South Korea decided, 6 p.m. we're just going to shut off the internet for a couple of days and see what happens.
I think it would be worth trying. It couldn't hurt at this point. I think the other kind of question it brings up is one of the problems with the internet is that the scale is just too mass. You can't live your whole life at that scale of that context collapse, broad audience. But South Korea has more of its life working at that scale than you might expect even offline. Discussed less in this book. I wanted a little more in kind of demographics and structure and family life setups in this book. But about half of South Korea lives in Seoul. So, it's like a little like Canada, a much smaller scale, where there's a sizable mass of land and everyone lives in one part of the country. And then you'll wind up with just whole provinces on the coast where there are almost no children. You've got this kind of emptying villages like in Japan. There's a feature in the Times on a school that has 4 kids in it. And as they move up, the grades just fold up and go away and they'll never reopen again. And they'll finish educating the kids they have and they're done. So you've got this problem of where are kind of the humane scaled environments for people to learn to live alongside each other. And instead you have these enormous apartment buildings. And I'm a fan. I'm a New Yorker, by birth and breeding. But kind of paired with the spy cams and people using telephoto lenses to spy on women in their apartments, I can see why you don't have that sense of I'm part of a big bustling city and I belong to it and we're here together. Every window is full of possible enemies. So I just didn't see much humane scale life starting in school. I don't know if someone wants to jump in a little about the structure of schooling in South Korea and the competitive examinations that feel like they make it hard to sustain normal childhood or friendships.
And also feed into this intense capitalistic and I love capitalism, but over indexed on competitiveness work culture that requires then binge drinking to cope with it, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? I mean, I the little bit about South Korea I knew before reading the book was these insane test regimes that they run, and shutting down the airports for the day and all that kind of stuff. To your point, it makes it really hard to form interpersonal relationships. It breeds the sort of authority questions that we saw in the book, and again, not unique to South Korea in the sense that we have Me Too scandals all the time in private schools in the US, but seems to be fed into this um intensely, it's more than meritocracy, right? I don't know what the next degree past that is, but that sense of just like working to the bone, that does not, but also relying on having a spouse at home, which is part of that straitjacket that so many women are rebelling against.
Yeah, part of it struck me as potentially a symptom of not having had the chance to organically develop stage by stage through the various historical processes that led the West to all of the sort of economic achievements and cultural touch points that now, again, based on this limited look, it seems like South Korea is now aiming at all sorts of milestones that, because they don't arise organically out of the internal dynamics of the culture, but instead are a response to kind of emulation or outside pressures, have to be frantically imposed from the top down or encouraged in these big cultural drives. And it seems as if there is organically and authentically a real ethos of whatever it is we're doing, we're really just throwing ourselves into it, and we're kind of sticking to this and hitting our targets. And the birth rate stuff has a flavor, or the population control measures have a flavor of that to me as well. There are two moments from relatively early in the book that are just always on my mind ever since I've read it, and they both seem potentially germane here. One is at the beginning of chapter 2, when the author explains how um, one of the many epochs in population control was to try to tamp down fertility, which in turn, as in China, produced a kind of preference against a potential preference against girls. If you only have so many kids, you want to have a boy. And so then the government decided it wanted to encourage girls as a to advertise the many benefits of having a daughter, essentially. Um, and with slogans like "Have two children and raise them well," or "With one well brought up daughter, one doesn't envy 10 sons." The successful campaign dropped the country's fertility rate. The number of children a woman is expected to have in her lifetime from over 6 in the early 1960s to around 2 by the 1980s, allowing families to invest more in each child they had, including daughters. And so the next sentence is about the return, the rising enrollment for girls in schools. And again, this is where the kind of just the like template or boilerplate tone of the book felt unhelpful, is that because in a kind of uncritically pro Me Too mindset, rising enrollment is good for rising enrollment for girls is good, right? These are metrics that we like: the rising enrollment, rising participation in the job force, without really interrogating like why or for what reasons, and is parity actually our aim here? So what is actually a kind of perverse and at least complicated result of this somewhat, to my mind, dystopian effort to control population is then sort of uncomfortably shoehorned into a narrative about like rising enrollment. And so even before you get to the drudgery of the kind of cram schools and the really hideous abuses going on from teachers, you have this story about like rising women that is masking all sorts of nascent dysfunctions. Then the other episode, and I know I'm already talking too long, so I'll shut up. But the other episode that sticks with me is in chapter 4, when the episode which takes up a fair bit of the first part of the book, which is this encounter at a funeral, where I think it's pronounced Seo is assaulted, fondled, and just generally mistreated by this sort of lecherous minister. It's briefly explained that the whole reason why she's sitting next to him in the first place is because she's been given this place of honor, supposed honor, next to this high positioned man, and that this is kind of what gives him the opportunity to behave very, very badly. And this occasions, again, a kind of explanation of the title of the book, which is that like women are expected to be flowers. They have this sort of decorative role that's counterpoised against the male realms of speaking and leading and so forth. And just dimly, sort of at a million miles remove, you can discern the outline of what may perhaps once have been a functional arrangement between the sexes in sort of the same way that you could discern like what chivalric culture might have been like. Not saying that that would have been a hazy golden age for South Korea. In fact, I actually have no idea what it was like in South Korea. Just that like there's a whole set of ideals that again is getting filed away under the nasty, bad, regressive before times, but is actually simply a different era that is now coexisting in this place where, quite rightly, women expect to be able to hold positions in law firms and so on and so forth. None of that actually does anything to obviate the responsibility of the minister to not behave like a total cad, which he then does. It's only to say that it does illuminate to me like this this very destabilizing and to me not sufficiently interrogated disconnect between what was once a stable relationship, but very much is no longer between the sexes, and what is obviously an unstable relationship in modernity that doesn't really know where to go.
I kind of bring that, Spencer, to an American example here for a second, because what you're talking about, this, the kind of best possible version of this, right, is that men desire women and so then seek to be worthy of a woman's attention. And what you're seeing is a kind of short circuit of that, right? Where the things that put that, lecherous minister in a position to have a woman assigned to him and not a particular woman, right? There's no fidelity here as part of this, which is more of the chivalric tradition. It's that every time he goes to an event, someone will find a woman and plunk her next to him for groping. And what that reminds me more of in the American context is where we see that, again, ideal, that sense that women in some sense call men to be their best selves, short-circuited. And I'm thinking here of the way football recruiting trips work, where it is definitely not allowed that anyone provide hookers to the football recruits. That's wrong. And the athletic department definitely has no knowledge of that happening, but it's not an uncommon occurrence. And then you have these boys who have achieved a certain kind of excellence, and before they even enroll in the school that's ostensibly there to educate them, receive this malformed education that their excellence isn't to be meant to be put at the service of a particular woman, to win a particular woman. It's meant to be kind of a pass key to get them a wide range of women. Again, not that these women are admiring of their wide receiver skills. They've been purchased for them. They've reached an echelon of power where they can trade money for women. And I think that's part of, if we go back to the American context, what if anything are the things we want to watch out for? Anything that disconnects the good of men and women relating to each other, admiring each other, slightly intimidated by each other, trying to be more for each other. Only fans, AI chatbots, are all something that's taking away that valuable feedback loop where men and women, desire each other's regard, respect each other enough to want someone to admire them, and then try and be more for that sake.
Well, and what I like about that point, Leah, is that it feeds into Spencer's earlier point about the sort of thin nature of success, or maybe the hollow version of meritocracy that we see on display in South Korea. You think about it in the story of the minister who is a very proud feminist ally, and then it turns out he's groping and assaulting and worse women too. And that's not unique to the U.S. We have plenty of examples of very loud Me Too male allies who turn out to be culprits in their own way. If you were only defining success along these sort of materialistic or sort of consumerist values, then you end up running that. Well, of course I'm an ally. I want to see women's labor force participation as high as it can go, and having my whatever indiscretions along the way don't really aren't seen it necessarily as at odds with that goal. I think that the story in the book, and obviously the ones that we know more better here at home, are examples you can't actually have it both ways. But that was kind of the I was like, that's a familiar archetype to anybody who's followed U.S. politics for the last couple of years.
I'm seeing some interesting questions in the chat, so I want to surface a couple of them. I'll start with the hardest one. Abby is asking, if you were chosen as South Korea's director of gender ministry, provided that they allow that position to exist, or advising them, what practical recommendations would you make? What could the way forward look like? Does it involve looking to the West? Patrick, you fix it first.
Well, I already said turn off the internet. I think that is a start. Maybe it's tough because, as you said, Leah, this isn't a matter of cracking down on a few bad apples. This is a structure of sin, to use that language. This is something that needs to be reformed from the ground up. And it's not just the relations between the sexes, right? Because we've talked about it stemming from these other cultural pressures that South Korea is putting on itself. And so I saw that question earlier from John about the sort of beauty ideals as well. I mean, these are no one's making, and this is part of also the I don't want to say complaint about the book, but the one-sided perspective of the book was, the beauty regimes that South Korean women put themselves through. Maybe there's some male pressure to do that, but oftentimes the call is coming inside the house, right? So how do you tell women in South Korea, and the West more broadly, if you want to, that you don't have to have your face perfect before you leave the house, and an hour of makeup or whatever that story was from the woman in part 4 every day? Those are really difficult questions. I don't think it's just a ministry question, or one sector of government. It's really a broader cultural shift. And in the same way that we've seen how Donald Trump is able to kind of exert a vibe shift on the federal government and many state governments as well, when it comes to DEI and some of these gender identity questions. Maybe the right politician in South Korea can help say what are we actually striving for here? What are the goals we are setting for ourselves? I don't think they're ready for that yet, but at least not anytime soon. But I think those are the deeper questions that a small tweak here or there is not going to do much.
Another
Eliza,
question.
I know we've had a little trouble with your connection, but are you able to jump on for what you'd like to do as the dictator of the South Korean gender ministry?
Yeah, I mean, that is a job that I would never take on, but I agree with Patrick that this is something that it's a much broader cultural problem, but I have seen over the past few years, and a few of these are mentioned in the book, and a lot of them I've seen through online feminist resources like Over It or Redux have been. One thing would be to stop the messages from the government saying, like, women, you're about to give birth, you should think about staying beautiful and making all the food and ahead of time so that your husband, like, there's so much still coming from the top, even though it is a much broader cultural problem, that it seems like there are a lot of things that would be obvious to prune, but it's very difficult to be like, okay, you have women in this book who, it's again because there's not so much of a picture of how do these women fit within society as a whole, how common is this among these generations of young women, but women who are exceptions and who are trying to opt out, and I think that there's not quite an appreciation for just the cost that women would pay if they weren't part of these communities to, not be beautiful, like that you could lose your job as a clerk for wearing glasses, like Leah mentioned. There is just, it would kind of be asking women to unilaterally disarm when they're still going to be judged by a standard that shows no sign of shifting.
Spencer, what about you?
Well, Leah, I want to return to your point about the version of traditional South Korean values that we're seeing on display here and the ways in which it's probably already in decline or has already become distorted and disordered. Because I think it was so important. The comparison with the football players is so important to me in that it highlights how essential the individual is in any scheme for quote unquote gender roles, right? I mean, it is true, of course, that one of our problems is we want archetypes and types generally to live into, and that's something that I think in the West we're particularly sensitive to the lack of those archetypes, and so we feel a desire to kind of recover healthy, meaningful, non-rigid but still kind of robust ideals about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. And at the same time, if you go so far in that direction that you end up in a condition where any woman will do, or indeed any man will do for this or that role, you're creating just as many and just as serious problems, which occasioned me to, it led me to wonder, and again, I have no idea, is this a thing sitting next to the head honcho at the funeral? Is this a thing that the hostess would do? Is it not just any woman, but the mother of the family or the person that is kind of presiding that has a role to play here? And are there, individual people who are expected and individual, does one take on certain roles at certain times? Which then I guess brings me back, and I am trying to answer the question, I promise. It brings me back to the family, because it's not just child policy that we're thinking about here, but family policy, right? I mean, what is there a way to encourage, and this is also related to logging off and getting offline, right? To encourage sort of working these issues out in manageable family-sized units, where the individuality of each person is kind of can be taken into account in a condition of love, rather than at the internet level or the national level, where it's very, very easy to fall into these kind of stereotypes, because what else are you going to do without, it's impossible to take every individual into account. Which in turn raises another question, and that is, the evangelical church, which I gather is kind of a force to be reckoned with in South Korea, appears in this book mainly as the sort of evil, like the retrenched opponent of gay marriage, and isn't that so awful that they don't want gay people to marry? And I wondered, was that also an artifact of the way this book treats its protagonists and sort of assigns villains and heroes? Is there a role for the church to play here also as a in real time, three-dimensional, person-to-person community space that does have ideas about what men and women are supposed to do, but also puts kind of love in the individual first? And as I'm listening to myself talk, I'm thinking like maybe I'm being just thinking about what I would do if I were head of America's gender relations, not South Korea's, because this all sounds very Western to me. But also maybe these are just kind of basic. These are sort of basic enough that they work. I'm thinking about church family and the individual, and how do you encourage those things? That would probably be my policy as whatever, what administrative role am I supposed to take? Director.
You're running the gender ministry.
Great.
Your
Yeah. Okay.
ultimate destiny. You've been preparing your whole life for this, Spencer.
No, I am Cincinnatus. I'm with Eliza. Don't don't make me do it.
I'm going to take a swing at this, but first I want to introduce Nadya Williams, who's joining us after a little bit of trouble getting on. Nadya's most recent book is very relevant to this book club. It's Mothers, Children, and the Body Politic, Ancient Christianity and the Recovery of Human Dignity. Nadya, I'm going to warn you what question you're jumping in on, and then I'll take my swing at it first, which is, if you became in charge of the South Korean gender ministry, what practical steps would you take to, bring an end to the sex wars? I'll take a swing first, and then I'm going to have a very quick last question drawn from the chat for everyone who wants to jump in. I think I would take a lot of my inspiration for what will reconciliation look like from the ways countries have handled losing wars. Questions of rebuilding, truth and reconciliation communities, right? But it seems like part of the problem here is you are living alongside people you have been at war with. You are not going to separate into two countries, two additional Korean countries, men's Korea and women's Korea. And so you're going to live alongside people who participated in or stood by during what you consider to be atrocities, without them being able to fully make recompense for that for you. And so the question is, what does, kind of journeying through grief look together when it's done as a shared community facing a future together? That is my plan for Korea. Nadya, what is your plan as director of the South Korean Gender Ministry? Actually, I'll give you one more second, so I realized I left one thing out. I think just the one other thing I think there's room for kind of penance and grieving for that hasn't happened yet in Korea. It's highlighted in the book. When they're trying to drive fertility down, the abortion rate just goes up so high, and there's coerced abortions, heavily encouraged abortions. But it gets to the point where Doctors in Seoul that says we're performing 2.5 abortions for every live birth, which is one of the highest known abortion rates in human history. And I think, this book, based on its perspective and view of feminism, kind of skips past that pretty quickly. Now people can decide whether or not to have abortions. We should decriminalize abortions rather than compel them. But I just think it's hard to have that positive case for what it means to be a woman with this mass slaughter of infants and mass horror at women's fertility in the so recent future. This was 1978. So I think some amount of that mourning and reconciliation happens between the genders, and some amount of it is mourning and reconciliation with what South Korea's government demanded mothers do to their babies and what it communicated about who mothers and women were as a result. All right, Nadya, now your solution.
Thank you. I walked away from this book just thinking more about what structures help us create a well-ordered picture of human dignity, and ultimately what is missing. So I was trying to think, Leah, your question, what is different about America? Why have we not dealt with this, and why has Korea been rocked with this? And ultimately, throughout this book, there is just no respect for women's dignity. But really, there's no respect for anyone's dignity. I mean, the men who are talking have no respect for their own dignity as human beings. So it's a really just awful, almost apocalyptic landscape of people are worthless. And ultimately, I walked away from this thinking without a Judeo-Christian framework that we have in America, even with the great dechurching and whatever else, there really is this residue that is still holding things together, that human beings are made in God's image and therefore are precious, every single one. And that gives us framework for treasuring every image bearer, for treasuring babies in the womb and outside the womb, for treasuring the elderly, and so on. And South Korea just doesn't have it. And that's the challenge. And that's the question to which I don't have an answer. And maybe that is the answer in itself. Without the Judeo-Christian framework for treasuring image bearers, all humans, as worthwhile, how do you create a system that respects people? Because clearly just passing a bunch of laws and telling people here's a checklist is not going to cut it. And so that's kind of, not a good answer, I guess.
And this brings me to our last question from John, which is about storytelling and pop culture. How does Korean music and pop culture contribute to this? Could TV, movies change things more broadly, assuming good writers and directors? I'll say also books. But I'd love to kind of, I think the most obvious problem in the K-pop industry is that the major figures that everyone sees and sees as aspirational are forbidden by contract from having children or even having partners. If you have a boyfriend as a South Korean K-pop star, your contract is terminated and you are shamed. And I know there have been people on this call, not to pick on Patrick, who have publicly rooted for Taylor Swift to marry her boyfriend and set a good example for America. But in South Korea, she would be punishable by revocation of her earnings and her master's for so doing. So that's kind of the negative side. And what I want to is the last question here is just any story or work of fiction that you would highlight that you think has a good positive answer to invite people into about gender or about the dignity of image bearers, as Nadya was highlighting. What is a work of art that currently exists that you would like to have a fighting chance in the South Korean cultural maelstrom? Who'd like to jump in?
Not a work of art, but I was thinking about the parallel again to the clergy. The idea, like, here is the Korean, this is what Korean clergy looks like. And that is a really shocking thought.
Yeah, I think, the model of celibate clergy is challenging everywhere. And it's interesting to think about that positive celibacy being set up against the negative, just no to partnership here. Eliza, what about you? A work of art, a way of life to set up in contrast to the K-pop, celibate empire.
Not a question I was particularly prepared for, but when I think about kind of a book about positive relations between the sexes and going through adversity in a time of great social change, I really think about Middlemarch a lot and just how much mutual understanding is sought in that book among very different couples, some of which is not attained. I mean, there's one couple where it's never found, but there are two couples in particular where they really are able to connect in a time of pretty great upheaval.
I like that answer, Eliza. And I like it also because of the largeness of the book and the world, that you're right, that there's a number of different couples struggling to understand each other. And I think part of the challenge is when people have a very narrow sense of the ideal rather than a wide range of the actually lived. Serena, would you like to jump in?
Sure. This is a tricky question. I'm like trying to think of a good work of art. A couple of novels that come to mind are North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, because that's also kind of like thinking through the effects of industrialization that, as we said, like the West had so much more time to work through. And I don't know, it's interesting because there's discussion of evangelical churches as being a big force in South Korean culture, but it's hard to tell from this presentation. We've touched on the way that she sort of very simplistically talks about trans issues at the end. And, there's a lot of reasons for me to kind of question her as a narrator or the depth of her understanding. And so I'm not sure how accurate the presentation of the role of the church and the culture is, or how nuanced, I guess, is maybe a better word. But it seems like, to Nadya's point, and something I think we just keep coming back to, is that there isn't this thick Christian understanding of not only human dignity, but also kind of the good kind of individualism. Like I think about in that era of capitalism, you had the Horatio Alger, like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, like that ingenuity, and that it was male coded, but then like women aspired to it, and we fought for women's right to have that. And that even the career and business, all of those things were kind of for the sake of fulfilling your actualities, or actualizing your potential as a human being, if that makes sense. Like, whereas the South Korean culture just seems so deeply collectivist, like there's not a healthy individuality there. Like there's these intensively externally imposed cultural roles, whether those are gender roles or your role in the corporation or whatever that is. So I'm not sure how, so I think that's kind of missing piece between, I guess, the evil traditional bad, simple archetypes of bad and good, and kind of the new cultural exports of the kind of Me Too stories that are sort of post-Christian, but kind of parasitic on older, fuller visions of human dignity and human rights. Like we in the West sort of, as we've said, kind of still retain some of that residue, but I feel like they need to kind of step a couple steps back and understand that vision of the human person, and only then can you kind of have a vision of relationality. So, and the other kind of sweeping novel that I think does this well and deals with like sexual sin and its effects really well is Anna Karenina. I feel like that would also be a good one for South Korean society to somehow grapple with. I don't know how you Mimi.
Yeah. I like that we're picking a lot of epics, and I think to kind of cast an alternate vision of human life, you need the sweep of an epic to see life live through setbacks and through different ages. And when it comes to epics, I don't know if that's what you're going to recommend, but there's no one I'd go to next except Spencer Klavan. What is your recommendation for the South Korean book club that is read by all of South Korea here? It's kind of
It's really funny. I was just sitting here thinking, man, I'm about to play against type in a big way because everybody's coming out with these beautiful classics, and I love both Middlemarch and Anna Karenina. But maybe it's just because I am a fervent, an unhinged evangelist for this TV show right now. So I advertise it everywhere. But I'm weirdly thinking, what if you took Severance, the TV show Severance, and showed it to, or, you know, made it, if I could wave my magic wand and make this a big TV show in South Korea. Initially kind of a counterintuitive pitch because this is a dystopian show about people living under completely dehumanizing conditions, tech-enabled dehumanizing economic conditions. The premise of the show, if you haven't seen it, is that there's a chip which divides your memories in half so that one half of you only remembers going to work and the other half of you only remembers not being at work. And it creates essentially two people living in the same body at different times. But my reason for wondering about this is, with Nadya's very beautiful comments about the Imago Dei, it's suddenly striking me that one thing the show is actually grappling with very seriously is how just how deeply personhood matters. That the moral questions in the show all have to do with, you've created this other person, and the personhood of this other person sort of keeps reasserting itself in these very inconvenient ways. You want this person to be your drudge that just does work, but it's a human. And so there are sex questions that arise from this, and there are labor questions that arise from this. And at the center of it, there's a very tender and beautiful, this is what made me think of it, very tender and beautiful relationship between the main male and the main female character, which is preserved and defended against all of these pressures, sometimes in very sort of extreme and I think lovely ways. So maybe like a dystopian show for a dystopian moment in a dystopian situation.
And I'm going to recommend a person. I'm going to recommend a South Korean woman, Saint Agatha Kim Agi, who was a convert to Catholicism, who was martyred in the early 1800s when the church was persecuted there. And the reason I'm picking her in particular from among all the South Korean martyrs is that when she converted to Catholicism, she wasn't able to be baptized. And the reason she wasn't able to be baptized is because her co-religionists thought she basically wasn't good enough for baptism. She had what we might call now a learning disability. We don't know exactly what her condition was, but she wasn't able to memorize the basic prayers of the church or the basic creeds. And so her community felt she hadn't cleared the bar for baptism. And it wasn't until she was in prison being tortured with her co-religionists, holding to the faith when many of them were discouraged, that they saw the power of her friendship with Christ and the dignity she bore, even though she didn't excel in any meritocratic way of seeing the world, that they kind of turned to her to lead them in prayer, even though all she could say in the prayer she would say is just, "I only know Jesus and Mary." And I think that's a good patroness for South Korea at this time, someone whose dignity was just inherent to her, who accomplished nothing in the eyes of the world, but who gave everything. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Serena to take us out and let you know where you can find more of these authors and more of these ideas.
Thank you guys so much. That was a great conversation. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in. We are all to be found at fairdisputations.org and on our Substack. If you enjoyed this, if you want to see more book clubs in the future, you can drop us a comment and suggest the next book that we should tackle. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful afternoon. Bye, everyone.